material. So this is almost the last part of the new material that we are presenting. And it's focused on the surface defect specifically. So last time what we introduced is the topic or the concept of the surface energy. So what we will do today is that we will learn about this, how this particular concept can be understood or how it can be applied, for example, to understand the grain boundary structure. We will also talk about other types of effects on the surfaces. Specifically, we will talk about defects on the surfaces of the materials and yet another class of defects that are called stacking faults in the materials that are surface related. At the end, if you do have enough time, we will talk about defects in liquid crystalline materials. If not, we will cover this on Monday. So the material specifically focused on the surface effects is in the Allen and Thomas book, chapter 5.3. And in chapter 5.2, you still have some material on linear defects in liquid crystalline materials. So last time we started the topic about the surfaces of the materials, right? So for most of the semester, we talked about materials, thinking about them as bulk. So we talked about the properties of the materials, their structure, their defects, how do we understand the properties from the symmetry of the materials, and everything really focused on the bulk of the material. And last time we started a discussion about surfaces, and we introduced the concept of the surface energy that comes from the fact that when you form one surface, there are extra dangling bonds that are free and that somehow contribute to this surface energy. And we even went through a very simplified version of calculations, how one can calculate the surface energy. So another very important topic or understanding how surfaces contribute to the performance of the materials is in terms of the surface defects. And there are a variety of defects that really happen at the surface of the material itself. So if you think about the material, again, if it was a cubic material, you typically think about this as a cube, right? It has certain type of facets, but very often these facets are not perfect, actually far away from being perfect. And the reason for that is typically driven by the growth of these materials and the processing of the materials. So for example, when you grow materials from either from solution or if you grow them using chemical vapor deposition techniques, etc., there are defects that are all listed here. So for example, you can form a terrace, which is simply one layer, one atomic layer of a material that exists on the surface of the bulk of the material. Within that particular terrace, you can make different types of defects like crevices, ledges, or you can, for example, have add atoms, which are individual atoms on the surface of the material that are separated from these terraces, etc. And this is just one example of these types of defects. So this is transmission electron microscopy image of a single crystal that again shows these terraces, steps, ledges, etc. There is even add atom here. So there is one or a couple of individual atoms that are separated from the bulk or other terraces and islands on the surface of the material. So these are all typically considered to be defects. And they're considered to be defects because they break the symmetry of the crystal itself, right? And they somehow break what is continuously known to be in the bulk. And you can think about these as defects, but very often they have very strong functionality. One very important example is the catalytic effect. So for example, there are specific types of devices in your cars that are called catalytic converters. And they're all composed, so they contain very small particles. And the types of the particles, etc., it's engineered and it's processed in different ways. But the main idea is that these small particles will have these surface types of defects. And for example, the role of these surface defects, so if this was the surface of the material, if this was the surface defect, there would be additional points where carbon monoxide can attach to the surface and experience chemical reactions. So what actually happens in cars is that you have a carbon monoxide, which is toxic, which interacts with air, specifically with the oxygen from the air, and it forms CO2. And again, this carbon monoxide will more likely attach to this type of a surface defect rather than on a flat surface. So in principle, when you're making these catalytic converters, the main goal, or one of the goals, is to make the surfaces as rough as possible, for example. So you want to make as many of these surface defects as possible, such that these catalytic effects are emphasized in comparison. So the surface to the volume ratio of these types of defects is maximized. So even if it's a very simple process that you can think about, there is a lot of engineering and processing that goes into this. Okay, so this is just one example where the surface defects are important. There are other types of catalytic effects where this is extremely important. So really making small particles where understanding of the surfaces and the surface defects becomes extremely important. And there is an entire field of material science that really deals with engineering these types of materials. It's a very, very active field of research.